Wyoming Territory, early spring of 1878. The wind came in dry and sharp off the foothills, and by the time the cowboy rode down into Willow Creek, the dust had already settled in the creases of his coat and the lines around his eyes. He had nothing but the clothes on his back, a worn saddle under him, and a quiet steadiness in his eyes that made folks look twice. His name was Asa Nolan, and he barely made a sound when his boots hit the ground in front of the town's only mercantile. He tied off his horse, gave the mane a quiet pat, then stepped through the swinging doors like a man with nowhere to be and everything to prove. Inside, a woman stood behind a counter, pale with sleeplessness, her arms cradling a baby no older than 6 months. She looked up when he entered, not startled, just wary, like someone who had seen too much too fast and was still standing. Her name was Kenzie Dawson. She had not always looked like this, her hair tangled, her voice hoarse, her eyes sunken with worry. But loss had a way of settling on people, and for Kenzie it had come with the winter, the baby and a husband buried in the frozen ground just outside town. Asa's eyes met hers, and something in him went still. The baby stirred in her arms, tiny fists balled against her collarbone. "You here to buy or passin' through?" Kenzie asked, adjusting the child on her hip. "Neither," Asa said. "Just needed a place to breathe." Kenzie's brow lifted. "You picked the wrong town for that. Folks here breathe suspicion first." He gave a small nod. "Fair enough. But I'm not here for trouble." The door banged open behind him, and 2 men stepped inside. Both wore the same oilskin coats, and both carried shotguns with the lazy confidence of men who had not been stopped before. Kenzie straightened as if pulled tight by a string. Asa turned, slow and sure. "We ain't here for you, stranger," one of the men said. "We need a word with the widow." Kenzie's face drained of color. She stepped back, cradling the baby closer. "You already said whatever you had to say last week," she said. "I told you I do not owe your brother any more money." "You owe what your husband owed," the second man said, voice flat, "and we are done being patient." Asa stepped between them without raising his voice. She said no. The room went quiet. Even the baby seemed to stop fussing. The first man moved fast. Asa moved faster. The shotgun jerked upward, but Asa caught the barrel and shoved it aside, slamming his fist into the man's gut. He twisted, yanked the weapon free, and turned it on the second man in one fluid motion. "You want to try your luck too?" Asa asked. The second man hesitated. Then he backed out, dragging the groaning first man with him. Kenzie stared at Asa like he had just pulled the sky down and handed it to her. He set the shotgun on the counter, quiet again. "You should not have to handle that alone." She blinked. "You do that often." "Get in fights for people you just met." "No," Asa said, "but I do not like bullies, and I do not like watching good people get cornered." The baby whimpered. Kenzie rocked her gently, her fingers trembling. "I do not have much," she said, voice soft, "but I can offer you supper." "It is the least I can do." Asa hesitated, then he nodded once. "All right." Her home was behind the mercantile, 2 rooms, warm from the stove, small enough that a man could feel the weight of grief in the walls. She offered him stew and cornbread, and they sat at her table, the baby nestled in a cradle nearby. "You always live alone?" she asked. "Been riding since I was 16, he said. "Never stayed long enough anywhere to call it something else." She looked at him for a long time. "That must get lonely," he shrugged. "Better than being trapped in the wrong place." Kenzie's gaze dropped to her hands. "I was not supposed to be doing this alone. Adam was supposed to see her grow up. He was a good man, just got in over his head." Asa looked at the sleeping child. "What is her name?" "Ara," she said. "She is all I have left." Asa leaned back in his chair, something shifting in his chest. "Maybe not for long." Kenzie's eyes met his again, and something passed between them, quiet, uncertain, but real. That night, after the baby was asleep, Asa went out to check the barn. He found one of the oilskin men waiting there with a knife. Asa did not back down. It was over fast. The man limped away, bleeding and cursing. Asa stood in the moonlight, breathing hard, then turned and found Kenzie watching him from the porch. She looked more worn than ever, but something else too, something open. "You could leave in the morning," she said. "No one would blame you." "I could," Asa agreed. "But I will not." Kenzie walked down to him, slow, then stopped within reach. "Why?" she asked. Because you should not have to fight them alone, he said. She nodded, her voice low. And if I am too tired to keep fighting, then I will fight for you, Asa said. As long as it takes. Kenzie stepped closer. Her fingers brushed his sleeve. I do not know what this is between us, she said, but I feel it. So do I, he said. The wind shifted and the night settled around them. For the first time in a long while, it did not feel heavy. Inside, Ara stirred in her cradle but did not cry. Kenzie looked up at Asa, and he saw the beginning of something steady in her eyes. He did not ride out the next morning. Instead, he stayed. 2 mornings later, Asa climbed the ladder to the roof of the mercantile with a bucket of pitch and a bundle of cedar shingles under one arm. The late March sun had softened the frost enough to make the repairs possible, though the wind still carried a bite that worked its way into his collar. Below, Kenzie swept the porch, her skirts pinned at the sides and a kerchief tied over her braid. Ara lay in a basket just inside the open door, wrapped in a blue quilt, her small hands twitching as she dreamed. Asa worked in silence, the scrape of his boot soles on the wood and the rhythmic tap of the hammer the only sounds above. When Kenzie finally looked up, shielding her eyes, she called, "Didn't ask you to fix that." "You didn't," he said without pausing, but the rain was pooling in the corner. "Figured you'd rather not have mold in the pantry come summer." She leaned on the broom handle. "Most men wouldn't know how to lay a roof unless they were paid." He looked down at her, one knee braced and his hat pushed back. "I'm not most men." Kenzie's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "No. You're not." By midday, he came down with pitch on his sleeves and sweat darkening his collar. She handed him a tin cup of cool water from the pump, and he drank it slow, standing beside the door while Ara babbled in her sleep. Kenzie watched him, then said low, "I'm not used to quiet help." "Quiet's all I know," Asa said, setting the cup down. "Seems better than making promises I can't keep." She didn't answer, only moved past him to lift the baby from the basket. Ara blinked up at her, then turned her head toward the sound of birdsong outside. Kenzie stepped through the threshold, rocking her gently. She does that every time she hears finches. Adam used to whistle in the mornings. I think she remembers. Asa followed her gaze to the bare cottonwoods beyond the yard. "You whistle? Not well," she replied. He reached for his belt knife and knelt by the porch rail, cutting a small willow branch. With his thumb, he began carving a flute, slow and sure. Kenzie sat on the top step, Ara resting against her chest, and said nothing more. By late afternoon, the flute was finished. Asa tested a note, low and soft. Ara's eyes widened, startled, then settled. Kenzie gave a sound almost like laughter. "That's the first time she's been quiet for longer than 5 minutes," she said. "I'll teach you," Asa said. "If you want," she raised her brows. "You're offering to teach a woman who hasn't had 2 hands free since November. You'll get time again," he said. "You won't have to do this alone forever." Kenzie looked down at Ara, then back at him. "You talk like you plan to stay." "I do," Asa said. She didn't speak, only reached out and took the flute gently from his hand. That night they sat inside, the fire catching on the stove and the baby sleeping in her cradle. Asa worked a whetstone over his knife, and Kenzie stitched a tear in one of his shirts without being asked. He glanced up. "You sew for every man who defends your roof." Kenzie didn't look away from the thread. "No, but I figured if you're going to keep wearing that thing, it ought to look less like it got dragged behind a mule." Asa chuckled, low and rough. "Fair." She tied off the thread and folded the shirt, laying it beside him. "You never told me where you came from." He rubbed the blade clean and set it down. "North of Laramie, we had cattle, a small spread. My brother stayed when I left." "Why'd you go?" He looked into the fire. "Too many ghosts, not enough ground to bury them." Kenzie didn't press. Instead, she rose and banked the coals, her movements slow with the weight of the day. When she turned back, her voice was quiet. "You saved us from more than those men, you know." Asa met her eyes. "I didn't come here to be a savior." "I don't need one," she said, "but I could use a partner." The words hung between them, simple and sure. Asa stood, walked to Ara's cradle, and rested a hand on the carved edge. "Then I'll be one." Kenzie came to stand beside him, shoulder brushing his. "I think she likes you. She doesn't cry when I hold her," he said softly. "That's something." Asa turned to her. "We'll make this work, you, me, and her." Kenzie searched his face, and whatever she found there made her lean in, slow and certain. Her lips brushed his, not a question but a quiet promise. When they parted, she whispered, "Don't go anywhere." "I won't," he said. The wind outside shifted again, but this time it carried the scent of thawing grass and the first hint of green. Inside the mercantile, the fire held steady. The wind changed on the fourth morning, blowing down from the high ridges with the clean bite of snow still clinging to the far-off peaks. It rattled the porch chimes and pressed against the smoke curling from the chimney, but inside the Dawson home, warmth held. Asa stood at the window, sharpening a drawknife on the leather strop he'd tacked to the wall. In the corner, Kenzie laid Ara on a quilt spread over the floor, coaxing her small fingers around a wooden spoon. The child gurgled, content with the weight of it, her bare toes curling against the fabric. Kenzie glanced up. "You ever worked timber?" Asa nodded once. "Spent a winter cutting pine near Saratoga, coldest I've ever been." She smiled without looking at him. "There's a stand of spruce south of the creek. Adam meant to build a smokehouse before spring. We'll need one if we plan to salt meat for next winter." Asa asked, setting the blade aside. Kenzie's hands stilled. "If that's still what you want." He crossed the room and crouched beside Ara, brushing a strand of sawdust from her cheek. "I've made up my mind, Kenzie." She rose slowly. "Then I'll show you the cut path this afternoon. You'll need the wagon." Outside, the frost had melted into the ruts, leaving the road to the creek thick with mud. Asa hitched the mule and loaded the tools without speaking, his movements steady. Kenzie walked beside the wagon, her shawl tugged tight around her shoulders. Ara stayed with Mrs. Bell, the schoolteacher 2 doors down, who'd taken to the child with a fondness that surprised everyone, herself included. The trail narrowed past the aspen grove, and Kenzie pointed toward a rise where the trees grew in tight. He marked the trunks with a hatchet, said they were straight enough for beams once seasoned. Asa stepped into the underbrush, pressing a hand to one of the blazed trees. "He knew what he was doing." "He did," Kenzie said. "We just ran out of time." She didn't speak again while Asa felled the first tree. He worked with clean, practiced strokes, the axe biting deep, then pulling free. When the trunk fell, she didn't flinch. They loaded 3 lengths into the wagon before the light began to fade. On the ride back, she sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, her gaze on the trail ahead. "You planning to stay through spring?" she asked after a long stretch. "I'm not planning to go," Asa said. She nodded. "There's a difference." He looked over, the brim of his hat cutting across his face. "I've never had a reason to stay before." Kenzie didn't answer. But when they reached the house and she lifted Ara from Mrs. Bell's arms, she didn't let go for a long time. That night, Asa cooked. He used wild onions and dried beans he'd found in the bottom of a jar, adding a pinch of salt with careful fingers. Kenzie sat on the floor with Ara, humming something tuneless while the child gnawed on a strip of leather cord. When the food was ready, Asa set 2 bowls on the table, then crouched beside them. "She's strong," he said. Kenzie looked down at her daughter. "She had to be. She gets that from you." She didn't look up. "I wasn't at first. After Adam died, I didn't know how to keep breathing. Some mornings I sat on the porch and listened for the sound of his boots, just to pretend for a moment longer." Asa didn't move. "You're still here." "I am." Her voice wavered. "But I didn't expect to feel anything again, not like this." He reached for her hand, slow and deliberate. "You don't have to explain." "I want to," she said. "You came out of nowhere, and suddenly I don't feel like I'm drowning anymore." Asa's hand tightened gently around hers. "Then let's build something that keeps us both above water." She looked at him then, eyes searching. "You sure? I've never been more." Ara let out a soft sigh and curled against her mother's leg. Kenzie leaned forward and pressed her forehead to Asa's. "All right," she whispered. "Let's begin." They slept that night with the windows shut tight against the wind, the fire burning low and the baby between them, her tiny breath steady as the ticking of the mantel clock. In the morning, Asa stepped out to feed the mule and found the first crocus blooming along the fence post. It wasn't much, just a pale purple bloom against the thawing ground, but it was enough. Kenzie stood in the doorway, blanket around her shoulders, watching him without a word. He reached for Ara, settling her onto his shoulder as she blinked at the new light. Then he turned, offering Kenzie his free hand. She took it without hesitation, and together they stepped into the day. By late April, the ground had firmed underfoot, and the last of the snowmelt had drained from the ruts in front of the mercantile. The smell of damp soil clung to everything, and the creek near the spruce stand ran louder now, swollen with runoff and spring promise. Kenzie stood at the edge of the pasture behind the house, Ara balanced on her hip, watching Asa dig post holes with methodical strokes. He'd stripped down to his shirt sleeves, the cuffs rolled above his elbows, and the sweat darkened the fabric across his back. "You planning to fence in the whole stretch?" she asked. He looked up, brushing his forearm across his brow. "Just the back half. Enough to turn the mule and maybe raise a few pigs." Kenzie shifted Ara to her other side. "You know anything about pigs? Enough to know they'll eat near anything you give them, and they don't mind the cold if you build the pen right." She set Ara down gently on a patch of dry grass, letting her sit upright between her knees. "Wouldn't be much, but it'd bring in barter come fall." Asa rested his hands on the post-hole digger. "That's what I thought." Kenzie knelt beside Ara, brushing a blade of grass from her sleeve. "You ever picture yourself doing this, fencing land, talking about pigs?" "No," he said. "But it feels right." Ara reached for a yellow flower sprouting just beyond her grasp. Kenzie helped her fingers close around the stem, and the baby squealed, triumphant. Asa watched them for a long moment, then bent to his work again. The clink of metal against stone carried across the clearing. That evening, Kenzie brought out a folded map her father had left her, the edges worn from years of use. She unrolled it across the table, smoothing a corner with her palm. "There's a stretch of bottomland east of here," she said. "About 3 miles, belongs to no one now. Adam used to talk about planting squash and corn if we could ever clear it." Asa leaned over her shoulder. "You thinking we try? I'm thinking it's good soil. And if we're going to stay, we should plan proper." He traced a faint line of the creek with his finger. "We'd need a plow. Old man Weller's got one rusting in his shed, said it needs new handles." "I can fix that," Asa said. Kenzie turned toward him. "You always this useful," he smiled, faint and slow. "Only when I've got a reason." She looked down at the map again, her voice quieter. "I like the idea of planting something and watching it take root." He didn't answer right away. Then, "So do I." The next day, she sent a note with one of the schoolchildren to Mr. Weller, offering a week's worth of preserves in exchange for the plow. The boy returned before noon with a nod and a handshake written on a scrap of paper. Asa fetched the plow and spent the afternoon in the shed behind the mercantile, shaving new grips from a piece of ash wood he'd split the week before. Kenzie came out just before dusk, Ara asleep in her sling, and stood watching the way Asa's hands moved sure and patient along the grain. "You're good with wood," she said. "My brother used to make chairs," Asa said. "Taught me to fit joints straight." Kenzie stepped closer. "You ever think about going back to see him?" He set the draw knife aside. "He wouldn't know me now, and I wouldn't know that land anymore." She let that sit. "Then, you've carved yourself into this place fast." "I didn't mean to," he said. "But I think I needed it more than I knew." She reached for the plow handle, running her fingers along the new wood. "You think Ara will remember this, the way it started?" "She'll remember feeling safe," he said. "Even if she doesn't know why." Kenzie looked up. "That matters," Asa nodded. "It does." Later, they sat on the porch, Ara curled between them, the stars just beginning to show above the cottonwoods. Kenzie leaned into Asa's side, her breath warm against his shoulder. "You used to ride from place to place," she said, "never stopping." "I did. Now you're here. With a baby in your lap and a woman with tangled hair beside you." Asa looked down at the child sleeping against his chest. "I wouldn't trade it." Kenzie's voice was soft. "Me neither." He turned toward her and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers rough but careful. She closed her eyes at the touch, then opened them again, steady and clear. "I want you to stay for every spring that comes," she said. "I will," he answered. The wind moved through the trees, lifting the scent of earth and spruce. Inside, the coals in the stove settled with a gentle crack. Ara shifted once, then stilled again, her small hand resting atop Asa's. He wrapped his fingers around it, and Kenzie laid her head against his arm. The stars climbed higher, and the night held. The first time Asa turned the bottomland, the soil came up dark and damp, rich with years of leaf fall and spring flood. He worked slow, the mule steady in the traces, the plow biting deep. Kenzie walked beside him, marking the rows with a length of twine and a sharpened stick. Ara stayed in her shawl sling across Kenzie's back, her breath warm against her mother's spine. By midday, the clouds had thickened, heavy with the kind of rain that settled instead of passed. Asa looked to the ridge. "We've got an hour, maybe less." Kenzie wiped her palms on her apron. "Enough to finish the last row." They did, just as the first drops hit the dust. They covered the tools with canvas and walked back to the wagon, Asa lifting Ara into his arms while Kenzie pulled the shawl tight around her shoulders. As they rode home, Kenzie said, "I'll start seedlings in the kitchen. We'll be able to transplant after the last frost." Asa nodded. "We'll build frames for the squash, keep them off the ground." Kenzie looked at him for a long moment. "You say we like you've always been here." "I feel like I have," Asa said, watching the road ahead. "Feels like I was meant to find this place." That evening, after the rain passed, they sat in the shed, oil lamp between them, working by firelight. Asa shaped slats for a seed box while Kenzie sorted beans and corn from a sack Adam had stored in the loft the previous spring. They didn't speak much, only the sound of wood and fingers and breath filling the space. Then Kenzie said, "I'm not afraid anymore." Asa looked up. "Of what?" "Of being left behind," she answered. "Of waking up to silence and carrying everything alone." He set down his knife. "You won't have to." She met his eyes. "You mean that?" "I do." She reached for his hand, calloused and rough, and laced her fingers through his. "Then I think we've made a life." In the weeks that followed, they built the smokehouse together, using the spruce Asa had felled that first month. Kenzie measured and cut with a carpenter's eye, and Asa handled the beam setting. When it stood finished, with the roof sealed tight and the door hung straight, Kenzie stepped inside and ran her hand along the frame. "Adam would have liked this," she said. Asa stood in the doorway, arms loose at his sides. "You think of him often, not the way I used to," she said. "I don't feel like I'm waiting for him to come back anymore. I remember him, but I don't live there." Asa stepped in beside her. "You're here now." "I am," she said, "and I'm glad of it." By summer, the corn reached knee-height and the beans twined around the stakes Kenzie had driven in May. The field buzzed with grasshoppers, and the creek ran low and bright. Ara learned to crawl on the porch planks, dragging herself after a wooden spoon Asa had carved for her. One night, after supper, Asa took Kenzie's hand and led her outside. He'd cleared a patch near the cottonwoods, set a blanket down, and lit a lantern at its edge. Fireflies blinked along the fence line. "What's this?" she asked, barefoot in the grass. He reached into his pocket and drew out a ring. A simple gold band worn smooth. "My mother's," he said. "She gave it to me before she passed. Told me not to give it away unless I was sure." Kenzie's breath caught. "And you're sure?" Asa nodded. "I want to build everything with you, Kenzie. Land, home, family, all of it. If you'll have me." She looked down at Ara, asleep against her shoulder, then back at Asa. "I already do." He slid the ring onto her finger, and she rested her head against his chest, his arms folding around her like they'd always known how. They married in the fall, in the field behind the smokehouse. Reverend Miller from the next town over came with a worn Bible and a voice that cracked halfway through the vows. Kenzie wore a dress she'd sewn herself, cream-colored with a faded lace hem. Asa wore a clean shirt and his best boots. Ara held a sprig of sage in her hand, waving it through the air like a banner. Afterward, neighbors brought bread and cider and jars of jam. Mrs. Bell sang an old hymn while the children ran between the fence posts. Asa held Kenzie's waist as they watched the sun dip below the ridge, painting the sky in copper and pine shadow. Later that night, with Ara asleep in her cradle and the fire banked low, Kenzie turned toward Asa in their bed, her voice soft in the hush. "I never thought I'd feel this full again." He traced the line of her collarbone with his thumb. "You gave me something I didn't know I needed." They lay there, quiet, the way people do who no longer need to speak every thought aloud. The seasons turned. The squash grew fat and orange in the field, and the smokehouse hung full by November. Asa built a cradle from oak, finer than the one Ara had outgrown. Kenzie planted bulbs near the door, hopeful for spring. They worked side by side through wind, through snow, through thaw and bloom and harvest again. And through it all, love held steady, Not in grand words or gestures, but in the way he took the baby each morning so she could wash her face, in the way she saved him the last of the pie crust, in the way they leaned into each other without needing to ask. Years passed. Ara grew taller, quick to laugh, sturdy as the land beneath her feet. She called Asa Pa one morning while chasing chickens, and he nearly dropped the bucket he was carrying. Kenzie caught his eye and smiled, deep and sure. They built a life in that place. Not perfect, but real and strong and theirs, and they never lived another day apart.